All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to IO Radio. I am your host, Adam, aka American Scream, and with me is Sal Bayette from Canada.
How's it going, everybody?
We're just going to do another interesting kind of reaction thing to what's going on in the community. We've got something fun that we thought we would. We're still testing out our whole podcast setup, which software to use, how we can do screen sharing. So we're still ironing some stuff out. So these are going to be little clips of us.
Luckily for us, there's always something to comment on when it comes to crypto.
And so we're going to be ironing out our tech, and eventually we'll have some full featured episodes that are centered around themes and things like that. So today there's a cartoon that's been making the rounds, and this is one of those ones where it's hard to tell if it's satire or not because it seems absurd, but then there's a lot of people that really believe it. As usual, it showed up on the Bitcoin subreddit, and of course the Buttcoin subreddit proceeded to immediately make fun of it. And we thought we would show the cartoon and address it sincerely, as if it is sincere.
Are you insinuating that this might not be correct?
That it is sincere when it's supposed to be satire, or vice versa?
that they're not right. I mean, the first panel says, or the second
Well,
panel
we
says
haven't
it
talked
cannot
about
be
it, what
printed.
it says yet, though.
Okay, we
But
should take people through it first.
all right, so let's show. All right, let me show the cartoon because I haven't put it up yet. Okay, there it is, right there. So this is an interesting cartoon. I'll describe it, and then me and Sal will kind of go back and forth, and we'll talk about what it says. It starts with, in the upper left corner, it says, "When you spend years learning about Bitcoin," and it says, "What is money?" And I do you want to maybe we'll just go through it
Indeed.
sequentially.
What is money?
Yeah. But anyway, I'll let people kind of just if you're watching this in the video, we're going to describe what the cartoon is. But it starts out and it's basically about somebody who's learned all about what they think money is, and then they learn about Bitcoin and how awesome it is, and then they try to explain it to somebody else, and they feel frustrated because the other person says, "What a weirdo." So it's kind of like one of those things where it's like all the crypto people find solidarity in pretending that they're way ahead of their time, and that's why nobody understands them.
I think the cartoon could be captioned "Few understand,"
Right.
and presumably there could be a sequel or too early. But this is definitely insinuating that it's very complicated. It requires a lot of research, but once you put all the pieces together, you see how great it is. But it just makes it very difficult to explain it. So if you don't understand it, it's because you haven't put in the time to learn.
Yeah, and I think that there's a premise here. We're going to unpack the claims in each frame of the comic in a minute, but the overall view seems to be that crypto people know something that we don't, and we think they're weird, and they think that they've stumbled onto something new and amazing, and we're the ones that don't understand.
Well, apparently they know the mind of God. It's a revelation, right? This is a revelation. Just
Depending
that
upon
we
who you
haven't
talk
been
to, yeah.
exposed to the revelation. So, I mean, right away, there's a lot of similarities to religion, but we can go through frame by frame. We can debunk it. We can comment on it.
Okay, so the first frame, I'm gonna close in on it. You've got this poor looking character that says, "When you spend years learning about Bitcoin," and there's a little character in front of a sign that says, "What is money?" So, what's your interpretation of that, Sal?
Well, what is money? So, it's interesting they chose that because, of course, Bitcoin is a terrible currency. It's used as a speculative investment. So, really, it's also sort of disinformation from the get go because Bitcoin isn't used as money, it's not used as currency. People like to pretend that it is, but the comic is insinuating that it is, that's what this is going to be about.
What also occurs to me is that the whole thing is positioning Bitcoin as the future of money. So, in order to understand why it's the future, you have to really understand how money works. But in my opinion, based on my own experience, I didn't have to understand what money was. I just know how it's used. I didn't need to
Yeah.
understand the history of it. I didn't need to know that 10,000 years ago people were trading seashells.
Well, I think what this is supposed to be is when people talk about money, they're typically saying, okay, it needs to be a few things. It needs to be a store of value. It needs to be a unit of account. And so there are these properties that money needs. And the next argument would be that, well, okay, Bitcoin has all these properties, but of course, money also needs to be its value needs to be supported by some type of inelastic demand. And so in the case of our society, or let's say Canada or the United States, we have to pay taxes. And so there's always a demand for that currency. And that's what gives it its value. That's what gives it its value.
Yeah, I would say the definition of money, if you look it up in Wikipedia, is something that is normally used for payment of almost all goods and services in a society. What makes something money is its utility, its use. Now, crypto people will claim anything that I can agree to transfer to somebody else in exchange for value is money, theoretically. But the traditional definition of money is something that's universally accepted in a society.
It has to be a medium of exchange, right?
Well, it has to be a medium of exchange that is pretty well established for everybody in society. I mean, I can take a chicken and find somebody who will take a chicken as payment for something. That doesn't mean chickens are money. See,
I don't
money
know.
has a very specific meaning in terms of a culture and a society and a civilization. I've got the definition, and it says
Yeah.
money is any item or verifiable record that is, this is the key point, generally accepted as payments for goods and services and repayments of debts such as taxes in a particular country or socioeconomic context. So that is what separates money from things that you barter with that might have value if you can convince somebody else. Money is the currency that is used wholesale by most people in a society. By that definition, crypto is not money. It still has to be converted into fiat in order to be used in most areas of society. So that to me is one of the reasons why the whole premise of this cartoon is inaccurate right off the bat, comparing crypto to money.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll move to the next one. So the second column, we start to learn about Bitcoin. You have your little character guy. He's apparently on a surfboard that has the Bitcoin logo in a sea of money. So you see this guy riding on a Bitcoin in a sea of money, and there's a sign that says cannot be printed. And then the little Bitcoin has a tag on it that says 1/21 million. Presumably, this is one of 21 million Bitcoins. And then in the sea, there's that infamous money printer that just seems to be spitting out money. So I guess this is a representation of the fixed deflationary nature of Bitcoin versus fiat.
And perhaps a commentary on the program of quantitative easing, or of governments expanding the money supply. What's interesting though is, why is that bad? Why is the idea that Bitcoin has a fixed money supply somehow inherently good?
Well, that's based on a bunch of ignorance that deflationary currencies are better than inflationary currencies.
Government can't abuse it, right? That's the comment here. The government can't abuse their power to expand the money supply and cause a hyperinflationary crisis.
Right. So first off, this idea that they're promoting it's kind of based on a premise that is misleading. This notion that the Fed or the governments are just printing money out of thin air with no accountability and no checks and balances. That's not true. It is true that the traditional monetary system, being a fractional reserve, can expand or contract based on the needs of the society. They look at that as a bad thing, although we just came out of a worldwide pandemic where we did a bunch of deficit spending to keep the economy from collapsing, to allow people to continue to get paid, to pay their bills and not lose their jobs. That obviously ran up more debt. And that's an issue. But that's the reason why these inflationary monetary systems were created in the first place, to get you past these hard times. And then the idea is, during the good times, you pay that debt back down.
It gives governments flexibility. They can match the amount of currency with economic activity. And so I just don't understand this notion of, if there's a political problem, and that's really where, if you look at all of the incidences of hyperinflation, they're always paired with a political problem, a serious crisis in some way. And in many cases, the issue is a special interest group that's taken control of that ability to expand the money supply. But I'm not sure that Bitcoin is necessarily different there. You can still have special interests. Bitcoin doesn't solve any political issues, it doesn't solve underlying crises. All it does is hand control. And assuming we all decide for some reason to use Bitcoin tomorrow, it just hands control of the money supply to private unaccountable special interests. I don't see that that's a solution to any of the existing economic problems that we have. I
Right.
mean, you can argue that the program of quantitative easing wasn't used correctly since 2008, and there's some argument to be made there that really that quantitative easing was really benefited the existing people who are already extremely wealthy. And so most of that money was used for mergers and stock buybacks. And it didn't really stimulate the productive economy. And so you didn't have a corresponding increase of, the supply side. And so that's why we're dealing with this inflation, this inflationary pressure. And so there are criticisms to be made, but I just don't see how Bitcoin solves any of that.
Yeah, not only does it not solve it, but its claims that it fundamentally is different than the traditional fiat system is also not true. And I'll demonstrate that. So in this column, in this particular cell, we see this, Bitcoin it cannot be printed in a sea of money being printed, right? Well, let's unpack the dynamics behind that. When money is printed, meaning more is created, where you're creating debt, that's not done arbitrarily. At least in the United States, that's done through an act of Congress. Right now, we're debating about raising the debt ceiling. That's how we create more debt, basically put more money into the economy. It's an act of Congress. It has to be voted on democratically, and obviously there's a big, huge battle. So it's not arbitrarily and so we have this public debate. Is it worth raising the debt ceiling? What are our options? How should we prioritize spending? What kind of concessions are we going to make if we raise a debt ceiling to make sure that we pay it back down later?
So presumably there's some democratic governance
Well, there absolutely
to
is when it
control
comes
that
to
process.
the money process. Yeah, and the Federal Reserve is audited, and every dollar that's in circulation is accounted for by independent auditors. And you can go on the Federal Reserve website and you can look at these audits. They're all listed and broken down by quarter. So that's there. It's not arbitrary like they're implying. So let's compare this to Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin says Bitcoin cannot be printed. There's only 21 million. Well, in reality, that's not true. Right now, there's close to 21 million, and the design of Bitcoin is such that it's supposed to stop and not create anymore once it's created 21 million. That's built into the code of Bitcoin. But that code could be changed at any time. A small group of developers that have access to the core bitcode can make some changes and suddenly make it 42 million.
Not even to go that far. Let's ignore that for the time being.
Well, wait, before we go anywhere.
What about the existing forks that have occurred?
Right. That's then you get into Bitcoin Cash is not regular Bitcoin. BTC is the real Bitcoin, not Bitcoin Satoshi's vision. So you could also argue there's already more than 21 million Bitcoin anyway. But the one point I want to make in direct comparison to their comparison with fiat is when fiat prints more money, it's a transparent act of Congress that everybody can see and debate, and there's direct democratic representation involved in that process. Bitcoin can do the same thing. Bitcoin can change the code and increase the supply of Bitcoin, but that's not a democratic process. That is not transparent. It's done basically by a small group of developers who have access to the code and in association with probably some mining consortiums that have 51% of the hash power. They can make this decision, and there's no democratic process. There's no voting. They can just decide to put more Bitcoin in circulation. So in reality, Bitcoin is even more shady and potentially irresponsible than crypto because it doesn't have the checks and balances.
Or than fiat, you mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it just goes to show there's a private special interest, or there's essentially a cartel. Now, whether they're early coin holders, centralized exchanges, any of these people that have a vested interest in seeing Bitcoin's price increase. I mean, the point is there's no democratic governance of that system.
Right.
It's completely opaque.
Now they say
And so,
code is law, but that code can be changed, and the people that have the right to change that code, you don't have any control over. Most people don't even know who has commit access to the Bitcoin Core repository. That's not it's not even public knowledge. Now, Bitcoin people will argue if somebody makes changes, we get to decide whether we want to accept those changes or not. If we don't, then those changes fork into a different version of Bitcoin.
but correct me, just to pause for 1 second here.
Mm-hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't the source code developers listed
No.
on publicly on a forum?
Well, there's a couple of forums where supposedly people try to keep track of who has access and who doesn't. But as far as I know, that's kind of an informal, casual list. And I've never been able to get confirmation of exactly who has commit access. It's not like,
So ultimately, that's not a transparent process.
no.
It's a process that's entirely voluntary, and we don't know.
Yeah. So this whole premise here in the second frame is misleading and untrue. Bitcoin can be printed more than 21 million. All you got to do is make a modification to the code. Now, whether that code's accepted by the community, that's something you can argue. But the same thing can happen in the world of fiat. You know, the community can reject, but at least the community has a little bit more say so via elected representatives.
I don't know. Like to me, that's not the main issue here. I think it's unlikely that they end up changing. I know some people have been arguing recently that it's likely that Bitcoin they'll increase the cap because of mining. Personally, I think that a lot of things are going to happen before that they would ever try that, because potentially it jeopardizes the narrative that they have about Bitcoin. But the fundamental issue here is sometimes it's good to be able to create more currency. You want more liquidity in the economy to facilitate
Right.
economic
Yeah.
productive activities. So framing it as a bad thing inherently is ignorant. It's how that power is used, whether it's democratically governed.
Right.
Those are the important considerations. Just the idea that, oh, because we have a fixed money supply, that's good, and a money supply that isn't fixed is bad, that's something that we shouldn't accept at face value.
Yeah. This whole premise of Bitcoin being deflationary and that being a good thing only appeals to the early adopters, the people that get in cheap early and hodl. You see at the top of the cartoon, the little hodler. That's basically the whole objective of this propaganda, is to convince people to buy and hold. And you're told, since it's deflationary, it will just keep going up the more popular it becomes. That's potentially true, but there's so many different ways in which that value can be diluted by forks, by altering the code, or by simply everybody rejecting Bitcoin in the first place and it dropping to virtually no value at all.
Yeah, and I think there's an important consideration here that isn't talked about a lot, and that is, what does it mean from the perspective of political power to be able to expand the money supply? All right, if you are somebody who, let's say, is hoarding a vast amount of wealth, that wealth can be diluted by the government choosing to print money. And then you will be forced to have to conduct some type of productive economic activity to be able to maintain that wealth. You can't just be like a dragon, make a bunch of money and then hoard it and never do work again and just use your existing position to be able to benefit.
Okay, hold on. You're completely correct there, but there is one misconception that's embedded into that premise, which is the notion that holding money is an investment. Money was never created to be held. So if you've
Yes.
got a bunch of
Yeah.
cash in a bank account, that is not expected to be an investment. Obviously, there will be inflation and the buying power of the dollar will continue to go down, but that's not necessarily a function of you losing money. If you've got some money that you want to put away, you put it into actual investments, things that create value, like stocks that pay dividends, real estate, those kinds of things. So,
Yeah, and that's a very important point
Yeah.
to point that out. And we don't want cash to be an investment vehicle. In fact, you want it to be slightly inflationary
Right.
because you want to incentivize people to continue to produce, to continue to work, and continue to do things, and not just be able to acquire $1 million and then never have to work again in their entire lives. That's not beneficial for society. And so the point is, if you think about this perspective of if it's a tool of political power as well, well, what happens if you don't have that tool? That's really why libertarians like the idea of Bitcoin, because it removes the ability of government to potentially almost have an indirect tax, right? The ability to print money and to expand the money supply can be viewed as a way, as a form of indirect taxation. And but what happens is if you take away that power and you create a fixed money supply, if there's wealth inequality, that can never be addressed in any way. And so Bitcoin is a system where any inequality is just, it's going to be there forever. There's no ability to redistribute wealth. And so if you are wanting to base a society around this, that's not a good thing. That's something that it's bad.
Yeah, agreed. So let's look at the third one here, which is two little characters, and they're tossing a Bitcoin from one continent to another over what appears to be an area that apparently says no Bitcoin. So Bitcoin cannot be censored. What's your thoughts on this, Sal?
Well, it's wrong. Bitcoin can certainly be censored.
Oh, but look, he's throwing that Bitcoin
Yeah.
over the other no Bitcoin sign. So it looks to me
So
like it's
there's this thing called the monopoly of violence, guys. States have the power to enforce laws in their territory. That's the system we have.
monopoly of
It's
violence.
not,
That's a libertarian term.
well, I don't know. It is correct. But the point
Well,
is
you're implying that violence is uh,
coercion. You can use a different word if you want, but ultimately the state has the ability to coerce people. The issue is that we grant that right to the state through a democratic process in the case of, Canada or the United States.
but that coercion is our our community's attempt to make the community more civil.
Exactly. I mean, we decide that, robbery is not something we want to encourage. So we have laws that deal with theft. And if you try to steal things, there is likely to be some form of coercion to stop you from doing that.
But it's my
You are
civil
not
rights.
free
If
to
I
steal.
if I want to steal
Yeah.
something, don't infringe on my civil rights to steal stuff.
So, the state is not perfect. It's not a perfect system, and governments aren't perfect, and human political institutions have problems. But I don't know that having not that I think Bitcoin is uncensorable. I don't think it is to begin with, but I also don't think that's necessarily a good thing.
So basically, you're saying this cartoon illustrates the ability to bypass social norms that we have established as a community, and those norms exist to make us nice to each other.
If we want to destroy the idea of having a state or having any government, then this is a desirable property. In many ways, money is the state.
But the
So,
state are the people too. That you know,
yeah.
we are the state. We create the state. Unless you live in a totalitarian regime.
So I guess there's sort of two things we can look at here. One is the statement even correct that it can't be censored? And two, is that even a desirable property? Is that something that we want? And I don't think that it can be censored, and I don't think it's a desirable property.
I would also add that one of the main reasons why Bitcoin can be censored is because it's truly not an autonomous system. You know, if crypto could be transmitted via, say shortwave radio, and people could power their own radio devices, then they wouldn't necessarily be dependent upon any government infrastructure. But that's not the way crypto works. Bitcoin operates on the internet, which is an invention that was created by government and is maintained and managed by government, as well as select private companies that the government gives certain pseudo monopoly rights to in terms of managing fiber and cable and radio frequencies. That all exists because the government specifically gives people the privilege to be able to use those resources. So everything that we use online is because of government. And without government subsidization, none of it would exist. Something as simple as using our phone involves the use of very specific frequencies that in the United States, the Federal Communications Commission says this company can use this frequency, this company can use that frequency. And if you set up your own rogue transmitter, they'll come after you. They police that. That requires a lot of resources to maintain. That's where the tax dollars come in. So if you create a system that is designed to bypass that infrastructure, there's no way the powers that be are going to allow you to do that in any way that really does affect their ability to maintain the infrastructure. It's just so I think Bitcoin is a parasite claiming that, the host that it's on can't do anything about it, which I find kind of hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, governments have been slow to move, but I think we're starting to see this pick up where states are starting to realize and institutions are starting to realize that this isn't something that is societally beneficial and it's not something we want to promote. It's actually not innovative. I guess this comment that it can't be censored is tied into this narrative about being against bad government and being against repressive states. But of course, that function can also and is predominantly used by people who want to engage in cybercrime and evading sanctions and running drugs and a whole host of activities that we don't want to encourage.
Yeah, and we could talk all day about the different ways in which Bitcoin has actually been censored. So this argument that
Yeah.
it cannot be, at the very least, this should be maybe difficult to be censored. Might be the more accurate, but absolutely, this is completely false that it cannot be censored. It can be censored, and it has been censored. China, has banned crypto mining, and they've probably knocked 99% of crypto activity out of their country because of this. Did they get all of it? No. But the nature of Bitcoin being a multi-node network, you need a certain critical mass of participants that are easily accessible. So if you even interfere with 20, 30, 40% of that network, you can effectively make it very difficult to use and impractical.
Also, the notion that Bitcoin doesn't somehow affect demand, that it's just extra energy, I think is very misleading. Because, of course, this will push prices higher. This will require old coal-fired or natural gas or other fossil fuel energy sources to be taken out of retirement. So they're taking mothballed plants and they're bringing them back online because all of a sudden somebody is willing to pay for the electricity that it generates. It's not just monetizing surplus energy. So this panel is extremely misleading. Well, like, what is this? Like, what are you really saying? I'm trying. Okay, I want to put on my crypto bro hat. I want to really try to understand the logic here. So, if everybody uses Bitcoin and all the governments of the world start using Bitcoin, and we get our beautiful dystopian future of our money supply being controlled by private, unaccountable parties, how does that stop war?
So the whole reference of war, I think, is kind of misleading, because if you're at war, then you're fighting to stay alive. I know that the modern version of war seems to be a little bit different than traditional versions, but what they're really implying, I think, is not really war as much as it is defense spending. And they're suggesting that if there's a deflationary amount of currency, we've got only so much to spend. We're not going to spend as much on war, but in reality, we're doing that right now. At least in America, the vast majority of our budget goes to military spending, and we're not even at war. So I don't see how, if we move to a deflationary currency, this would suddenly make war unaffordable.
No, it's ridiculous. What are they saying here? So I think what they're trying to get to is technology, Bitcoin, blockchain solves all the world's problems. It solves disease, it solves hunger, and it solves war. So I don't think they're trying to make any kind of logical point. This is just trying to promote the currency because, of course, the value of Bitcoin is tied to adoption. They always need new liquidity entering into the system. You need a greater fool to buy your coins from you. So this is just promotion.
Well, here's an interesting fact.
There,
Apparently,
is
according to
is
Crypto
it
Bros.
sure?
Well, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say, is there a coherent argument? I mean, tell me I'm wrong, but what is the argument here? What are they trying to say?
Well, I think they're saying that if you use a deflationary currency that is limited, that has fixed assets, that you're going to be a lot more responsible with how you use it, and this responsibility apparently is going to apply to making war unaffordable, which is interesting because if this premise was actually true, then that would mean that no country that's ever used deflationary asset-backed currency has ever engaged in war. And I mean, the United States did have a gold standard, and I'm pretty sure that we got involved in wars when we had gold-backed money.
Absolutely. But every other panel, I think we have issues with. We can discuss it, we can debate it. People who are pro crypto might have a different opinion. We don't think it's a good idea. We think, surplus energy, the panel is ridiculous. But this is just moronic. You don't understand how the world works.
Well, every panel, I think, completely disregards the sum total of all human history. You know,
Yeah.
we can take every single panel and point to something in the past where there was a monetary system that was similar to Bitcoin, and it didn't fix any problems. It didn't promote clean energy. It didn't promote peace. It wasn't censorship proof. Yeah, it's just a bunch of inaccurate affirmations. So this leads us to the final cell, where having learned all of this, you take years to learn about Bitcoin. You get to the end where it says, and after all this, you try to explain it to a newbie. Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace. And they respond, what a weirdo.
Let me be very clear. Bitcoin and its proponents will do anything, say anything. Doesn't matter how big the lie is. Doesn't matter what the consequences are, the externalities. It doesn't matter what the damages are. They will say anything. They will promise anything as long as it increases the value of Bitcoin. And so that's what, when you're looking at the person who's telling you that Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace, your thought shouldn't be what a weirdo. It should be what a selfish asshole.
Well, if you believe this premise that they sincerely believe this will save the planet and create world peace, then you can, then you can be like, oh, you're so
Well,
cute.
they're an idiot then. I mean, and there certainly are people
Or
who,
are we just being bitter cynics?
yeah, well, we're clearly bitter cynics. I mean, that goes without saying. And there are certainly people who really sincerely believe that Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace. But it's very easy to believe that if it also benefits you financially.
Yeah. So the question is, are they being really, really sincere when they make this claim that Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace? And are we just being bitter and cynical because we don't appreciate their sincere desire to make the world a better place? You're suggesting they may not be all that sincere.
Well, I think there are some people who are sincere and believe that it's going to make the world a better place. But I don't know, it reminds me of that quote by Upton Sinclair when he said that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Hmm.
And so, this propaganda, this disinformation, it's in their financial best interest. And so they have a vested interest in promoting this stuff, this garbage to people to try to get them to invest in it as well.
And if this cartoon was actually a little bit more realistic, well, of course, nothing about it is realistic. But before the guy says what a weirdo, he probably had a few other questions that are left out. So the crypto guy comes to you and he says, Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace. And the first response would be, how exactly does it do that? Oh, well, look at the other things. Well, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense.
No, no, ask me the question. Ask me the question. I'll tell you the answer.
Of well,
Ask me the question that of why Bitcoin will do that.
Bitcoin will save the planet and create world peace. How is that? How is that going to happen?
Well, let me tell you, Adam. It's a deflationary currency that's uncensorable. It monetizes surplus energy and makes war unaffordable.
Okay. So that's a great example of begging the question fallacy, where you make a statement that has a bunch of presumptions in that statement that you haven't actually provided evidence are true. And that's basically what this entire cartoon is, makes war unaffordable. Well, if we dive into how it does that, it doesn't make sense. And this is what really bugs me about the crypto people. And the reason why this guy's calling him a weirdo isn't because he has a naive idea of how to save the world. It's when you ask him more specific questions about, yeah, this claim, this doesn't seem to make sense. You know, if you really care about world peace, then you want to hear any criticism. Okay, so you disagree about how to get world peace. You have a better idea. Let's listen to your idea. That they're not really sincere in that respect.
They don't need to explain it any further. The point isn't to actually accomplish these goals. The point is to drive up the value of Bitcoin.
Right. So the whole thing is just disingenuous.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we zoom out and we take the cartoon as a whole. And the thing that comes to me is, who is this for? Is it satire or is it serious?
It's propaganda.
So you think it's serious?
It's propaganda. It's disinformation. It is twofold. One, we want the flock to maintain their faith. They need to hodl because that's important. Because if they don't hodl, they take fiat liquidity out of the system and it could collapse. We need them to hodl. We need them to keep their money in the system. The second goal, maybe we can get some new investment. That's very important. We need new entrants in the system. We need more people buying Bitcoin because we want to sell ours. And the third thing is, hey, maybe we can influence public opinion. Maybe if the person doesn't own Bitcoin and we can't convince them to buy it, maybe they look at this and they say, oh, well, I don't think I'm going to get any, but maybe we should, regulate Bitcoin and make it legitimize it. And so it's attempting to influence public opinion. And it's ultimately the goal is to make somebody money.
All right. So the overarching view here seems to be that your crypto people are these innocent people that just want to save the planet and create world peace. What we find is underneath it all, there's a selfish motive that's not being elaborated on in here. In addition to finding it disingenuous, it just is really pretty fraudulent. You try to reason with these people, and they just dismiss you. They call you haters, or they say you don't understand, which is why you end up with the last claim of, what a weirdo. I mean, what else do you have to do if you can't reason with them? You might as well shame them.
Maybe we're the weirdos for having talked about this for 35 minutes.
That is so true. That's probably a good note to leave it on. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And if you disagree, you got your own ideas, be sure to leave some comments and, we'll address them. And until next time, thank you guys for tuning in.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.